Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. Some wounds no longer hurt in a sharp way, but they still leave a mark. Not to keep us angry, but to remind us that something once collided there. And sometimes what exhausts us isn't the nail that's been pulled out, but the way we keep standing there staring at the hole it left behind. Derek was 52, a mechanic used to metal parts and movements that required just the right amount of force. That afternoon, he stood behind his house, where an old wooden fence separated his small yard from the alley behind it. Late sunlight slanted through the fence boards, forming long, narrow streaks of light. The space was quiet, filled only with a light breeze and the smell of freshly cut grass. In Derek's hands were a hammer and a pair of pliers. He wasn't fixing a car today, just tightening a few loose boards. Small, familiar work that didn't ask much thought. He bent down, clamped the pliers around an old nail, and pulled slowly. The metal made a soft sound as it came free from the wood. The nail was out, but the hole was still there. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Derek brushed his fingers lightly over the edge of it, feeling the rough grain of the wood. It didn't hurt. There was just a faint sense of emptiness. He thought about his most recent apology. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a sentence spoken after a few days of silence. The other person had nodded, had said, "It's okay." And logically, the matter was settled. But inside him, something hadn't quite smoothed out yet. Derek wasn't someone who held on to things for long. He was used to fixing problems, repairing what was broken, replacing what was worn, tightening things until they were done. But some things once pierced don't return to their original state right away, even after the nail is removed. Not because forgiveness didn't happen, but because the material needs time. He slipped the nail into his pocket and moved on to the next one. Each nail he pulled left behind another small hole in the fence. From a distance, nothing looked different. But Derek knew they were there. Like moments in life that seem resolved, yet still leave faint traces behind. The wind picked up slightly. Derek straightened, stretching his back. His spine gave a quiet pop. He let out a longer breath than usual, not from fatigue, but from noticing something shift. Not everything needs to return to perfect to be considered okay. He bent down and took a thin sliver of wood, tapping it gently into one of the holes with a hammer. The motion was slow and careful. No forcing, no rushing. The new wood didn't match the old exactly, leaving a faint line where the colors met. Derek paused and looked at it. He didn't try to hide it. He just made it sturdier. Some apologies don't erase the mark, but they can soften the edges. They make the place less sharp, less likely to hurt when brushed against. And maybe that's enough for now. Derek set the hammer aside and sat down on the back step. The sunlight softened. The yard settled into a warm, golden tone. From this distance, the small holes in the fence weren't so noticeable anymore. They hadn't disappeared, but they no longer filled his entire view. He thought about how he used to wish everything could go back to the way it was, as if nothing had happened. But life doesn't work that way. Life gives us marks, then teaches us how to live with them, without letting them decide the whole story. Derek rested his hands on his knees. His palms were dusted with fine wood shavings. He didn't brush them off right away. He just felt them there. There was a quiet kind of ease in accepting that some gaps don't need to vanish for us to finally rest. The fence stood there, not perfect, but solid. And in the last light of the day, Derek saw that he was much the same. As the sun dropped lower, the light behind the house began to change. The pale gold faded, stretched, then dissolved into shadow. Derek stayed seated on the back step, not because he was tired, but because there was no need to stand up right away. Sometimes the body knows on its own that there's nothing urgent left to do. He looked at the fence again. From this distance, the small holes were barely visible. They were still there, but they didn't ask for attention. Derek realized that for a long time, he had been standing too close to the marks inside himself. So close that he forgot how different things look when you step back just a little. He stood up, brushed the wood dust from his hands, and carried the tools into the shed. The door closed with a solid, familiar sound. A simple end to the workday. Nothing ceremonial, just putting things back where they belonged. Inside the house, the air was quieter. Derek washed his hands at the utility sink, cool water rinsing away the smell of metal and sawdust. He let the water run a few seconds longer than necessary, not because it had to, but because it felt good. When he turned it off, his hands felt cleaner, lighter, as if a thin layer of tension had been rinsed away too. He went into the living room and turned on a small lamp. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't play the radio. Those sounds could wait. Tonight, the quiet felt complete on its own. Derek sat down, leaned back, and let the chair fully support his weight. The memory of the apology no longer felt sharp in his mind. Not because it had been erased, but because he wasn't staring straight at it anymore. Some words have already been spoken. Some marks simply need time to soften. Both can be true without canceling each other out. Derek thought about how he used to rush to fill every gap right away, as if not doing so meant everything might fall apart. But the fence was still standing, even with its imperfections. And so was he. Some places that had once been hurt were now just faint traces, no longer sharp the way they had been at first. He stood up and walked toward the bedroom. His steps were slow and steady. Nothing was pulling him to hurry. When he lay down, he didn't search for the perfect position. He just rested the way his body wanted to. The blanket settled over his shoulders. The temperature was just right. Small details that became clearer once his mind stopped working so hard. Derek's breath moved in, then out naturally. No counting. No adjusting. Each breath felt like a quiet reminder from his body that things were okay enough. He didn't need to be completely healed in order to rest. Some nights what we need isn't to erase every mark from yesterday. We just need to know they no longer hurt when we touch them. They can remain as part of the surface without still being sharp nails. If tomorrow, when the light returns, Derek notices the small holes in the fence again, he doesn't need to fix them right away. They aren't threatening anything. They simply remind him that there was once an impact and that there was also an effort to soften it. The room slowly settled into silence. No conclusion, no promises. Just a man who had stopped standing so close to old nail marks, and a body allowed to rest within its own imperfect wholeness. And in that very gentle acceptance, sleep arrived without needing a name. Like letting the wood be what it is, instead of asking it to become what it once was before the nail. Some doors don't need to be locked from the outside. They close very softly, almost without a sound. And then we get so used to being inside that we forget we ever had the key. Ben was 31, working in startups, living alone in an apartment that was darker than it needed to be. Not because he liked the dark, but because bright light made his thoughts feel louder. That evening, he sat on the sofa with only a small lamp turned on near the wall. The warm yellow light reached the ceiling enough to give the room shape, but not enough to demand his attention. Ben's phone rested in his hand. The screen lit up, then went dark. Lit up, then dark again. Old notifications. Messages he hadn't replied to. Emails he had read but never reopened. He didn't act on any of them. He just held the phone like holding a thread that connected him to a place he didn't want to return to. There was someone Ben hadn't forgiven. Not because that person hadn't apologized. The apology had come long ago. Short, clear, no excuses. But inside Ben, the door stayed closed. Not to punish anyone, only because he was afraid that if he opened it, everything would rush in at once. He had thought about it many times. About keeping distance. About protecting himself. And in a way, he had succeeded too well. So well that there was no one else left in that space with him. Ben set the phone down on the table, then picked it up again. He had done this for many evenings in a row, as if holding it meant he was still in control of the story. But every time the screen went dark, the room felt larger and the silence more noticeable. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was still moving. Car lights stretched into long lines. No one knew he was standing there. No one was waiting for him to respond. The thought felt both relieving and sad. Ben remembered the first time he decided to close the door. There was no ritual, no announcement, just an evening much like this one, when he felt too tired to keep explaining, too tired to keep hoping. And so he closed it slowly, firmly. At first it felt like safety, like being in a room where no one could interrupt. But over time, the room stayed the same while he changed. The air grew heavier. The distance between him and the world stretched longer. Ben returned to the sofa and sat down. He unlocked the phone, looked at the screen, then locked it again. A small click echoed in the quiet. The sound made him pause, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Familiar enough that he'd never really noticed it before. He tried something very small. He didn't open an app. He didn't read a message. He simply placed the phone face down on the table, so the screen could no longer look at him. A sense of emptiness appeared right away, like closing a side door and suddenly realizing how quiet the main room is. Ben rested his hands on his thighs. His shoulders were tight. He let them drop slightly, not to relax, just because they were tired. In that moment, he noticed something that surprised him. This door might never have been locked from the outside at all. No one was standing guard. No one was holding the key. There was only him sitting here, used to staying inside. The thought didn't make him jump up and open the door right away. It simply created a small opening, just enough to let the space feel less suffocating. Ben leaned back into the sofa. The yellow light was the same. The room was the same. But the feeling of being trapped wasn't as solid as before. It shifted into a quiet question. If I open the door, what's the worst that could happen? He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. Tonight wasn't the time to decide. It was enough to know that the door wasn't a wall, and that the thickest walls are sometimes built from habit alone. Ben closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to stop seeing the door. When he opened them again, the room hadn't changed, but the tightness in his chest had eased just a little. And that alone was enough to make this evening feel less like a sealed prison than it had before. Ben stayed seated on the sofa a little longer. There was no urge to do anything next. Without the phone clenched in his hand, his palms rested empty on his thighs. But the emptiness wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd imagined. It felt like taking off a heavy jacket and realizing the room temperature is just right. He stood and walked into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead light, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. Ben poured himself a glass of water and took small sips. The coolness slid down his throat, waking his body slightly, but in a gentle way. He didn't need more caffeine. Tonight, he didn't need to stay alert, guarding anything. When he returned to the living room, Ben noticed the door to the balcony. It was closed but not locked. He looked at the handle for a moment. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to open it. He just looked. And for the first time in months, the thought "I'm stuck" didn't arrive with that image. He remembered the early days after the inner door had closed. Back then he believed he was protecting a wound. And maybe he was. But over time, the wound had changed. It no longer needed the same level of guarding. He just hadn't updated the way he was living with it. Ben went back to the sofa and sat down again. His back settled into the cushion legs stretched out. This wasn't a defensive posture. It was the posture of someone resting. His breath moved in and out steady. No counting, no adjusting. Nothing here was threatening him. He thought of the other person briefly. No clear image, no specific words, just a faint presence. He realized he didn't need to decide about forgiveness right now. He only needed to stop imprisoning himself inside an undecided moment. Some doors don't need to be thrown wide open for us to feel freer. It's enough to know they can open. Enough to stop leaning our weight against them all day long. Ben stood and pulled the curtain back a little. The city outside was still lit. No one noticed whether he opened the curtain or not. A light breeze slipped through the gap, bringing in cool air, a small exchange between inside and out. He went to bed. He didn't bring the phone with him. He didn't bring the old story either. When he lay down, his body responded quickly. The blanket rested over his shoulders. The temperature was just right. Nothing else needed arranging. Ben closed his eyes. He wasn't trying to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy with the rhythm of his breath. The door in his mind wasn't fully open, but it wasn't sealed shut anymore. Light wasn't flooding in, but air was moving. If tomorrow he still isn't ready to step outside, that's okay. No one is counting the days he spends in or out. There's no sentence waiting. Some processes don't need speed. They just need the lock to be gone. The room was quiet. No sound of bolts, no click of locks. Just a man who was no longer holding himself as tightly as before, and a body allowed to rest in a space that finally felt wide enough. And in that gentle loosening sleep arrived, without needing to pass through any door at all. Some words, when left unsaid, begin to speak inside us again and again. Not to be heard, but to be carried. And sometimes what exhausts us isn't that the other person doesn't understand, but that we've been carrying those unspoken words for far too long. Lila was 55, a volunteer at an end-of-life care center. Her work required quiet presence, listening more than advising. She was used to unfinished sentences, to things left unsaid before time closed in. Maybe that was why that evening when she got home, she felt a familiar pull to write. She turned on the small desk lamp in her study. The soft yellow light fell onto a wooden desk worn smooth at one corner. Lila pulled out the chair, sat down, opened a drawer, and took out a blank sheet of paper. No title, no "Dear Someone," just a wide open space. She held the pen and paused for a few seconds. Her hand didn't shake. She just didn't touch the paper yet. Some things, even when they've been ready inside us for a long time, still need a moment of permission to come out. Then she began to write. Not in order, not carefully polished. Some sentences were short, others long, Some words pressed darker into the page, others faded. Lila wrote about times she'd been misunderstood, moments she'd been overlooked, things she'd swallowed because she believed saying them wouldn't change anything. She wrote about anger that arrived late and quietly, but stayed for a long time. There were no sharp accusations, just truth placed on the page as honestly as she could manage right now. As she wrote, she didn't imagine the other person reading it. That wasn't necessary. This letter was never meant to be sent. With each line, a piece of weight moved out of her chest. It didn't disappear. It shifted. From inside her body onto the paper. And that movement alone made her breathing feel a little easier. She stopped when her hand grew tired, set the pen down, looked at the page filled with words. She didn't reread it from top to bottom. She didn't need to. She had already been inside every sentence while writing it. Reading it again wouldn't add anything. She folded the paper in half, then into quarters. Slow, careful movements. Not because she was afraid of tearing it, but because she was closing a flow. When she set the letter aside, she noticed her hand felt lighter, like she'd just put down something she'd been holding all day. Lila stood and went into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water. Cool, clear. She drank in small sips. Some evenings, the body needs very simple things to remember, that everything is safe. Back in the study, she looked at the letter again. It lay there quietly, not demanding, not urging, not needing a reply. And in that moment, Lila realized something gentle and true. Not every word needs a recipient to have meaning. Some words only need to be spoken so the speaker can finally rest. She picked up the letter and stood in front of the small trash bin beside the desk. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood there a little longer, making sure she didn't need to hold on to it anymore. The desk lamp lit the neatly folded paper. Outside, the night was still. Nothing pressed her. No deadline waited. The letter had done its work. Lila didn't burn the letter right away. She placed it back on the desk, turned off the light in her study, and walked slowly into the kitchen. Not because she was hesitating, but because her body needed a few more minutes to catch up with what had just happened. Some forms of letting go happen quickly in the mind, but take a little longer to sink into the body. In the kitchen, she turned on the small gas burner and set an old metal bowl on top. She didn't use a strong flame, just enough heat to warm. The pale blue flame stayed steady, no flaring, no rush. Lila watched it for a moment, as if matching her pace to its rhythm. She went back to the study and picked up the letter again. The paper felt softer now from being folded so many times. There was no sense of regret, only a clear stillness, like when a conversation has reached the point where nothing more needs to be said. Lila tore the letter in half, then into 4 pieces, then 8. Each tear made a very small sound, almost blending into the quiet hiss of the burner. She didn't reread a single word. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Now, it didn't need to keep its shape. She carried the pieces into the kitchen and dropped them one by one into the metal bowl. The paper touched the flame, curled inward, then darkened. There was no large fire, just a soft orange glow spreading slowly enough to change the paper. Lila stood there without interfering. No stirring, no rushing. When the last piece turned to ash, she turned off the stove. The kitchen returned to silence. Inside the bowl was a thin layer of pale gray ash. Words, no sentences, no voice left. Just the trace of something that had finished being said. She let the bowl cool, then carried it outside and poured the ash into a small planter on the balcony. The ash fell into the soil and blended in quickly, leaving no distinct form behind. She didn't think about symbolism. It simply felt right. What had once been heavy could now become something that fed something else. Back inside, Lila turned off all the lights, leaving only a dim glow in the hallway. The familiar space held her gently. She went into the bedroom, changed, and lay down. There was no feeling of mission accomplished, no sense of victory, just the feeling of not having to carry anything anymore. Her breathing slowed and evened out. Her chest no longer felt tight like it had earlier in the evening. There were no sentences in her mind waiting to be written, no responses being prepared. A kind of emptiness appeared, but it wasn't cold. It felt like a room that had just been cleaned, carrying the faintest trace of freshness. Lila thought of the people she met through her work. People who had carried so many unsaid words until there was no longer time to speak them. And she realized that tonight she had given herself a very quiet gift, saying what could be said while there was still time so she wouldn't have to carry it any further. If old memories return tomorrow, that's okay. They can knock. But the door is no longer locked from the inside. Not because everything has been fully forgiven, but because she's no longer keeping herself trapped in the same room with them. Lila turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. The room was just dark enough. No sudden sounds, no thoughts needing attention. What remained was only the lightest sensation of a body that had finally set down an invisible weight. The unsent letter had completed its purpose. It didn't need a recipient. It didn't need a reply. It only needed to be written and then allowed to dissolve. And in that dissolving, the night opened wide. Sleep arrived not as an ending, but as a deep pause when there were no more words left to hold. Nina didn't plan to garden that afternoon. She'd only stepped into her tiny backyard to take out the trash, still wearing her daycare t-shirt with a cartoon sun on the front. The day had been one long stretch of small hands and loud feelings, kids melting down over the wrong cup, the wrong snack, the wrong crayon. By the time she got home, her patience felt used up in the same quiet way a phone battery dies. Not dramatic, just suddenly red. The air outside was warm, but not sticky. The kind of late-day light that makes everything look softer than it felt. Nina paused near the fence and noticed a cluster of weeds pushing up along the edge of the garden bed. Thin stems, stubborn leaves, little green flags claiming space. She stared at them longer than she needed to, because that's what anger does sometimes. It finds a harmless target. She told herself, I should pull those. It'll take 5 minutes. It'll feel productive. She went inside, washed her hands, and came back out with a pair of gardening gloves she'd bought months ago and barely used. When she slid them on, the fabric felt stiff and new. Like it didn't know her yet, she crouched near the weeds and gripped the first one, hard tugging straight up. It snapped. The top came off in her hand, while the rest stayed buried in the dirt. Nina's jaw tightened. She grabbed another and pulled even harder. Snap again. 2 clean breaks, like the weeds were making a point. Of course, she muttered, more annoyed than the situation deserved. Nina was 35, and most people would describe her as calm, soft-spoken, good with kids, the kind of person who could talk a 3-year-old down from a full-body tantrum with a quiet voice and a silly song. But there was a version of her no one saw at work, a version that showed up later in the car, in the shower, or here alone in her backyard with dirt under her nails. That version was tired, and when she was tired, anger didn't look like shouting. It looked like tension. It looked like replaying the same moment over and over. It looked like holding a grudge against someone who probably wasn't even thinking about her anymore. Earlier that day, a coworker had said something small and sharp in the staff room. Not a scream, not a fight. Just a comment thrown casually, the way people do when they're stressed and don't notice where their words land. Nina had laughed it off at the time, smiled, changed the subject. But the sentence followed her home like a burr stuck to her sleeve. Now crouched in the dirt, she realized she was pulling weeds the same way she'd handled that moment, trying to remove the visible part without touching what was underneath. Keep it neat. Keep it quiet. Don't make a scene. She stared at the broken stems in her gloved hand. The roots were still down there, untouched, holding firm. Nina shifted her weight and tried again, this time with a different grip. She pinched closer to the base, right where the plant met the soil. She loosened the dirt around it with her fingers, slow and careful. The earth was slightly damp, cool under the surface. She felt the plant give a little, then stop, then give again. When it finally came out, it brought a thin root with it, longer than she expected, pale and wiry, like a little cord. Nina held it up and stared, a little surprised. It wasn't the weed that was strong. It was the root. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rest of the patch. If she kept snapping the tops off, she could clear the surface quickly, sure. But the weeds would come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'd return quietly, stubbornly, because the real part of them was still there. She knew that feeling. Anger, when she tried to be mature, didn't go away. It just went underground. It waited. It resurfaced later as sarcasm, as coldness, as a tight chest at night when she was trying to sleep. She pulled another weed, slow this time, loosening the soil first. It came out clean, root and all. The motion felt different in her body. Less force, more patience, more honesty. She thought about the co-worker's comment again, and for the first time she asked herself a question she usually avoided. What did that actually touch? Not the words themselves, the place they landed. Because the truth was, Nina's anger wasn't only about that one comment. The comment was just the top. Underneath it was a root, the feeling of not being respected, of being the one who always stayed late, the one who always cleaned up, the one who always said yes because she didn't want to be difficult, and then quietly resented everyone for expecting it. That was the root. Nina didn't judge herself for it. She didn't lecture herself about boundaries or communication. She just noticed it the way she was noticing the roots in her hand, thin but persistent, stretching farther than the surface suggested. A breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost like a metronome. Nina kept pulling weeds one at a time, slower than she'd planned. And as she worked, she could feel the anger shifting, not disappearing, not turning into forgiveness on the spot, just changing texture. When she snapped the tops off, her anger felt sharp and urgent, like it needed to be acted on, like it needed to win, like it needed to do something. When she eased the roots out, her anger felt more like information, like a signal, like a part of her that was saying quietly, "You've been holding too much." Nina paused and rested her gloved hands on her thighs. She looked at the small pile of weeds beside her roots, exposed, no longer hidden. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. She realized something else too. Trimming the top had always been easier, faster, cleaner. It made her look calm. It kept her image intact. But pulling the root, naming what hurt, admitting what she needed, that was the part she avoided. Not because she didn't know how, because it made things feel messy for a minute. And Nina had spent most of her life trying not to be messy. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff. She brushed dirt from her gloves and looked at the garden bed. It wasn't perfect. There were still weeds. There always would be. Life kept growing things, some of them helpful, some of them not. But she could already tell the ones she'd pulled from the root weren't coming back the same way. She gathered the weeds into a small paper bag. The bag crinkled softly in her hands. As she walked toward the trash bin, she felt her shoulders lower just a fraction. A tiny release. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a speech, just a quiet understanding that sometimes anger isn't asking you to explode. Sometimes it's asking you to go deeper. And Nina, still tired, still human, still carrying the day on her skin, felt a little more willing to do that slowly, one root at a time. Nina didn't finish pulling all the weeds that day. She tied the paper bag loosely and left it by the back door, meaning to take it out later. The garden bed looked uneven now, some spots clear, others still crowded with green. It wasn't the neat before and after she usually preferred, and somehow that felt right. Inside, she rinsed her hands at the sink. Bits of dirt swirled away and disappeared, leaving her fingers clean, but a little tired. She noticed how the tension in her shoulders had eased without her telling it to. No deep breathing, no fixing, just less holding. That evening, as she folded laundry on the couch, the moment from work came back again. The comment, the tone, the way she'd smiled and swallowed her response. But this time, the memory didn't flare. It arrived quietly, like a weed she already recognized. She didn't push it away. She asked the same question again, gently. "What's the root here?" The answer didn't come as words right away. It came as a feeling in her chest. tight, familiar. The feeling of being overlooked, of being the one who adapts so others don't have to, of being kind and hoping maybe unfairly that kindness would be noticed without being named. Nina let herself feel that for a moment. Not the anger on top, but the tiredness underneath. It was heavier, but also truer. And strangely, it didn't demand action. It just wanted to be seen. The washing machine clicked off. The sudden quiet filled the room. Nina stacked the towels, slowly aligning the edges without thinking too hard about it. Ordinary movements had a way of making space for things to settle. Anger, she realized, often comes from something reasonable, a need that's gone unspoken, a boundary that's been crossed too many times. When she cut it down at the surface, telling herself to be nice or let it go, that need stayed buried, still growing. That night, lying in bed, Nina didn't rehearse an argument. She didn't plan a confrontation. She didn't decide what she would say the next day. She simply noticed that she felt less tight than usual. Her breathing found its own rhythm. In and out. Slower than earlier, without effort. The house made its nighttime sounds, pipes settling, a distant car passing, the soft tick of the clock in the hall. She thought about the garden again. How pulling the root took more patience, more time, and dirtier hands. How it also meant the weed didn't have to be fought again tomorrow. Not everything in her life needed to be resolved right away. Some things just needed to be acknowledged at the right depth. The next morning, Nina stood at the staff room counter pouring herself coffee. The coworker was there too, scrolling on her phone. Nothing dramatic happened. No apology, no repeat of yesterday. But Nina noticed something different in herself. When the coworker spoke, Nina didn't brace. She didn't shrink. She didn't smile automatically. She just listened, shoulders relaxed, attention steady. The anger that had been buzzing under her skin the day before wasn't gone. But it wasn't driving anymore. It had become information. Later, during nap time at the daycare, the room was dim and quiet. Small bodies rose and fell on their mats. Nina sat in her chair, hands resting loosely in her lap. She felt tired, but not depleted. There's a difference. Exhaustion that comes from giving too much feels sharp, resentful. The tiredness she felt now was softer, honest. The kind that comes from doing the work that actually matters. That afternoon, when she got home, Nina stepped into the backyard again. The weeds she'd left were still there, of course. Life didn't rearrange itself overnight. She pulled one more slowly, feeling the soil loosen, the roots slide free. She didn't rush to finish. She didn't aim for perfect. Anger, she understood now, doesn't need to be cut down or crushed. It needs to be understood at the level it grows. Above that, everything is just maintenance. As dusk settled in, Nina left the garden as it was and went inside. The paper bag still waited by the door. The work could continue another day. For now, it was enough to know where the roots were. In bed, as the room darkened and the day finally released its grip, Nina felt her thoughts slow. Nothing needed to be solved tonight. Nothing needed to be pushed away. Some things, once seen clearly, stopped demanding so much energy. And with that, the mind, like the garden, was allowed to rest. Sophia stayed longer than she needed to. The classroom was empty, the hallway lights outside already dimmed to their evening setting. Most of the building had that after-hours quiet. No footsteps, no kids' voices, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional click from somewhere down the hall as the building settled. She stood by her desk with her tote bag still on her shoulder, staring at the whiteboard like it might tell her what to do with the feeling that had been following her all day. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even loud anger. It was disappointment. The kind that sits behind your ribs and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Sophia was 30, an elementary school teacher, and she had learned how to keep her face calm even when her heart felt bruised. A classroom demanded steadiness. Kids could sense it the way animals sense weather. If she carried too much tension, they carried it too. So she smiled when she had to. She kept her voice warm. She did the lesson. She cleaned the glue sticks off the tables. She reminded a kid for the 4th time to stop chewing on the eraser. She managed. But in the quiet, when the room finally belonged to no one, the feeling returned with more clarity. It started with a message. Just one line on her phone earlier that morning. A parent email, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. The kind of message that reads like concern, but feels like accusation. It wasn't the first time. But today it landed differently. Sophia had stared at her screen in the teacher's lounge, coffee in hand, and felt something heat up in her chest. Not because the parent was entirely wrong, not because she was guilty, but because she was tired of being doubted by people who didn't see the whole day. She typed a response 3 times, deleted it 3 times. Finally, she wrote something short and professional and careful, the kind of email that takes all the emotion out of your body and turns it into safe sentences. Then she went on with her day, like nothing happened. Now, standing in the empty classroom, she could feel the leftover heat in her throat. The words she didn't say. The urge to defend herself. The urge to be seen. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The sky was a pale gray blue, clouded over in a way that didn't look like rain, but didn't look like clear weather either. The sun wasn't visible. Still, the light was there, spread out, muted, filling everything without a direct source. Sophia remembered something her grandmother used to say when she was a kid. The sun is always there. Clouds just cover it for a while. Back then, Sophia thought it was just about weather. Now she understood it as something else too. When she was angry at someone, the anger became the only thing she could see. It colored the entire person. It turned one moment into a full identity. One email into a whole story. They don't respect me. They think I'm careless. They're looking for a reason to blame me. And maybe there was some truth in that. Or maybe it was just the cloud doing what clouds do, blocking the sun, making the world feel darker than it actually was. Sophia turned back toward her desk. Her hands moved without thinking. She straightened a stack of worksheets, aligned the corners, put a marker back in its tray. Small actions, tidy actions. Actions that made sense when the mind didn't. She tried to be honest with herself softly. She wasn't only angry at the parent, She was angry at the whole system that made teachers feel like they were always on trial. The endless pressure to prove you're doing enough. The way a single complaint could make you question months of effort. And under that anger was something even quieter fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of not being good enough, fear that one day someone would be right. Sophia sat down in her chair and let her tote bag slide to the floor. The strap made a small thump against the desk leg. She exhaled long and slow, like her body had been waiting for permission to do that all day. She thought about the parent again, about the kid actually. The kid who had smiled at her during reading time. The kid who brought her a dandelion from the playground and said it was for luck. The kid who sometimes came to school a little too hungry, a little too quiet. Sophia didn't know what was happening at home. She didn't know what kind of day the parent had. She only knew what the email had sounded like. And the email had made a cloud that was now sitting in her chest. She didn't need to excuse it. She didn't need to pretend it was fine. She just needed to remember something important. A cloud is not the sky. A cloud is not the sun. A cloud is a passing thing. Sophia reached for the light switch near the door and clicked off one row of fluorescent lights. The room dimmed slightly. She clicked off another. The hum softened. The classroom became gentler, less sharp around the edges. In the lower light, the whiteboard looked less demanding. The desks looked more like quiet furniture than stations of responsibility. The whole room felt like it was exhaling with her. Sophia stood by the door for a moment, hand on the switch, and let the last bit of heat in her body settle. The email would still be there tomorrow. The story would still be there if she wanted to pick it up again. But tonight she didn't want to carry it home. Not the cloud. Not the storm she could make out of it. She turned off the final lights, locked the classroom, and stepped into the hallway where the building felt cool and calm. The sun, she reminded herself as she walked, hadn't gone anywhere. It was just behind something for a while. Sophia didn't check her phone on the drive home. It sat face down in the cup holder, silent, dark. She noticed the urge to reach for it anyway, just to see if anything else had come in. Just to confirm the story hadn't changed. She let the urge pass. The road ahead was familiar streetlights, spaced evenly, each one appearing and disappearing at a steady pace. Her shoulders dropped a little as she drove. At home, she left her shoes by the door and didn't turn on the overhead lights. A small lamp in the living room was enough. The apartment felt still in that end-of-day way, like it had been waiting patiently for her to arrive and stop moving. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window while she drank. Outside, the sky had darkened completely now. The clouds were still there, she could tell, but they'd blended into the night. Nothing dramatic. Just layers of gray moving slowly, doing what they do. Anger has a habit of overstating its case. It takes a moment and stretches it into a verdict. It takes one interaction and uses it to explain an entire person. Sophia could feel how easily she'd slipped into that earlier, how the email had begun to stand in for the parent, for the relationship, for the whole year. But now, with the day at a distance, the feeling had changed shape. It wasn't gone. It just wasn't loud. She sat on the couch and let herself sink into the cushion. Her body felt tired in a clean way, the kind that comes after holding a lot and finally setting some of it down. She rested her hands on her lap and noticed how warm they were, how steady. The image returned to her, not the email, not the words, but the sky from earlier. The way the light had still filled everything, even without a visible sun. She thought about the parent again, but differently this time. Not as an antagonist, not as a character in a story, just as a person likely tired in their own way, worried in the way parents often are, when they don't know how else to be. This didn't make the email okay. It didn't erase the sting, but it softened the edges. Forgiveness, Sophia realized, didn't have to be a feeling she summoned. It didn't have to be warm or generous or complete. It could be as simple as refusing to let one cloud decide the weather forever. She wasn't forgiving the behavior. She was forgiving the moment, its power. Later, as she got ready for bed, Sophia caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked calmer than it had that morning. Not happier, just less tight. She brushed her teeth slowly, unhurried, watching the familiar movements. When she lay down, the apartment made its quiet nighttime sounds, the faint hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the building settling. She pulled the blanket up and exhaled long and even. The email drifted through her mind once more, lighter now, like a thought passing through open air. She didn't follow it. She didn't push it away. She let it move on its own. Somewhere between one breath and the next, she understood something simple and steady. People are not their worst moments, and neither are we. Anger can make it feel otherwise. It can convince you that what you're seeing is the whole truth. But anger, like weather, changes. It moves. It thins. The sun doesn't need defending. It doesn't need arguing. It just waits. Sophia's breathing slowed as the room grew darker. The day loosened its hold. Tomorrow would come with its own clouds, its own light. She didn't need to solve any of that now. For tonight, it was enough to rest in the knowing that clarity returns on its own when we stop staring at the sky and demanding it be different. Some things pass best when they're allowed to. Lily noticed it in the mirror before she noticed it in her thoughts. Her jaw was tight, not clenched enough to hurt, just enough to hold. The bathroom light was too bright for the hour, washing her face in a pale reflection that felt more honest than flattering. She leaned closer to the sink, turned on the tap, and let the water run while she stared at herself as if the mirror might explain when the tension had started. She couldn't pinpoint it. The day had been ordinary. Meetings stacked on meetings. A conversation that went sideways. An email copied one too many people. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth carrying home. And yet, here it was, this tightness, this heat, this feeling that something needed to be answered. Lily was 47, an HR manager, practiced at keeping her voice even. She knew how to de-escalate, how to choose words that didn't inflame, how to look calm while other people weren't. All day long, she helped others soften their reactions. At night, she was less careful with herself. She splashed water onto her face and felt it drip down her wrists. The sensation was grounding cool against skin that felt warm for no good reason. She turned the faucet off and reached for a towel, pressing it gently along her cheeks. The thought arrived again, uninvited. Something she should have said. A reply she should have sent differently. A sentence from earlier that still felt sharp. Lily felt the urge to push back, to rehearse a better version of the conversation, one where she was clearer, firmer, more respected. The impulse was strong, almost physical, like leaning into a gust of wind and expecting it to stop. She remembered something her father used to say when she was a kid, usually when she complained about how unfair something felt. "Don't spit into the wind," he'd say. "It only comes back at you." At the time, she'd rolled her eyes. It sounded dismissive, like giving up. Standing there now, towel in hand, she understood it differently. Spitting into the wind wasn't about silence. It was about timing, direction, knowing when a reaction would only make things worse, when the force you put out would return straight to your own face. Lily lowered the towel and looked again at her reflection. The tightness in her jaw was still there. The feeling hadn't gone away just because she'd named it. Anger rarely does. It lingers. It circles. It waits for a moment when you're tired enough to give it a voice. She leaned back against the counter and crossed her arms, feeling the cool edge press into her lower back. The bathroom was quiet except for the faint hum of the exhaust fan. A contained sound. Predictable. Nothing arguing back. The conversation replayed anyway. Not the words themselves, but the feeling underneath them. The sense of being misunderstood, of being held responsible for something she didn't control. Lily had spent years learning how to absorb that without flinching. How to take responsibility without taking blame. Tonight it felt heavier. She imagined sending the message she wanted to send. The sharp one. The clarifying one. The one that would finally put everything in its place. She imagined the momentary relief of hitting send. And then she imagined the reply. The defensiveness. The escalation. The back and forth that never really resolves anything, just redistributes the discomfort until everyone is tired. Spitting into the wind. Lily uncrossed her arms and rested her hands on the counter. Her fingers were cool now. The heat had moved, softened. She took a breath, not deep, not intentional. Just a breath that happened when she stopped holding it back. There was a difference between not responding and not reacting. She knew that. One was a choice. The other was a reflex. Tonight she didn't want to add her voice to the noise. Not because she was afraid, because she was done with the cycle. She turned off the bathroom light and let the room dim to the glow of the hallway lamp. The mirror faded into shadow. Without her reflection staring back, it was easier to feel what her body was doing on its own. The tightness eased a fraction. Not enough to feel resolved. Enough to feel possible. Anger, Lily realized, wasn't asking her to fight. It was asking her to stop taking the wind personally. To stop meeting force with force when the direction guaranteed pain. She moved toward the bedroom steps, slow, unhurried. The house made its nighttime sounds, pipes settling the refrigerator clicking on and off. Ordinary, unconcerned. The thought came back one last time, quieter now. The reply she hadn't sent. The words she'd swallowed. She didn't push it away. She just didn't send it into the wind. The night didn't ask her to be right. It asked her to rest. Lily slept more deeply than she expected. Not perfectly, not without waking once or twice. But the kind of sleep where the body does most of the work on its own, without the mind interrupting every hour to check if something has been missed. When she woke just before morning, the tightness in her jaw was gone. Not replaced by clarity or solutions, just absent. That felt like enough. In the kitchen, the early light was soft and gray. Lily filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and waited for the familiar click. The house was quiet in that gentle way it gets, before the day asks anything of you. She stood at the counter with her hands resting flat on the wood, noticing how neutral her body felt. No heat, no push. The thought from the night before tried to return. It didn't arrive with force. It arrived like a test. The unsent message. The urge to correct, to clarify, to make sure she wasn't misunderstood. Lily watched the thought come in and didn't follow it. She didn't argue with it either. She let it pass through like air moving across an open window. The kettle clicked off. Later that morning at work, the situation resurfaced. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind her it hadn't disappeared overnight. A meeting. A familiar tone. A comment that could have gone in several directions if she let it. Lily felt the first flicker of irritation rise, and then space. Just a breath's worth. She noticed how quickly her body wanted to respond, how practiced the reflex was. Years of training, years of managing reactions, other people's and her own. But she also noticed something new. The irritation didn't feel like an order. It felt like information. She listened. She spoke when it was useful. She stayed quiet when it wasn't. She didn't push her point into the room, just to prove she had one. And when the meeting ended, she walked out without the familiar residue of frustration clinging to her shoulders. That surprised her. At lunch, she sat alone at a small table by the window. Outside, a steady breeze moved through the trees, bending the branches in one direction, then easing. Lily watched the leaves respond without resistance. They didn't argue with the wind. They didn't lean into it or away from it. They moved as much as they needed to and no more. Anger, she thought, often feels like standing directly in that wind and shouting into it. Not because you think it will listen, but because you can't stand the feeling of being pushed without pushing back. But the push always comes back. That afternoon, an email arrived, the kind she would normally reread too many times. The kind that invited a defensive response if she wasn't careful. Lily read it once, then once more. She felt the old heat try to form. She closed the laptop. Not permanently, not as avoidance, just enough to keep from spitting into the wind. She stood up, stretched, and walked to the water cooler. The cold water shocked her tongue in a clean, simple way. She swallowed and felt it move through her chest, grounding her again. By the time she returned to her desk, the urge to react had softened. The words that needed to be said, if any, were clearer now. Fewer. More precise. less fueled by heat. She typed a short reply, honest, neutral, no extra edge. Then she sent it. And that was it. No replay, no bracing, no waiting for the impact. When Lily got home that evening, the air felt different. Not lighter because things were fixed, but lighter because she hadn't added more weight to them. She washed her face at the sink cool water again and noticed how natural the motion felt now. No tension hiding behind it. Anger hadn't disappeared from her life. It never would. It would return in small gusts and sudden squalls, as it always did. But tonight she understood something more clearly. You don't have to meet every force head-on. You don't have to respond just because something hits you. You don't have to turn discomfort into self-inflicted pain. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is step slightly to the side. Let the wind pass. Let it lose its target. As the house settled into evening and Lily prepared for bed, her thoughts slowed without effort. The day didn't follow her into the dark the way it used to. There was no need to defend herself there. The night was still. The wind had moved on, and Lily, no longer standing in its path, was finally able to rest. Madison didn't realize she was still angry until she turned the ring light off. The room went dim in a single click, and suddenly there was nowhere for the energy to go. No bright circle of light to perform inside. No screen glow to hold her face together. Just her living room in the late evening quiet, a little messy and honest. She stood there with her phone in her hand, thumb hovering where the comments had been scrolling non-stop for the last hour. Her live stream had gone fine. Better than fine. Good numbers. Plenty of hearts. People telling her she looked great, asking about the product, the link, the shade name. Then one comment landed different. Not even the worst one. Just the kind that's written casually and still cuts. Must be nice to have time for all this. Madison had laughed on camera, made a joke, moved on. She always moved on. That was part of the job. But as soon as the live ended, the comment stuck. Her mind replayed it, turning it into a whole thread of imagined voices. They think I'm lazy. They think this isn't real work. They think I don't deserve what I have. Madison was 27, a full-time creator, and she had learned that the internet didn't just watch you, it projected onto you. People wrote their own stories over your face. They saw 5 minutes and assumed they knew your whole life. Most days, she could handle it. Tonight, it got under her skin. She set the phone down on the couch and walked to the kitchen barefoot on the hardwood. The refrigerator hummed. The sink had a few dishes she'd promised herself she'd handle after the live. The air smelled faintly of vanilla from a candle she'd burned earlier. She filled a glass of water and drank half of it in one go, like her body was trying to cool something down. Anger doesn't always feel like fire. Sometimes it feels like a filter, like someone slid a tinted sheet over your eyes, and suddenly everything looks hostile. The neutral becomes suspicious. The ordinary becomes insulting. Even silence feels like judgment. Madison noticed it when she glanced at the pile of laundry on the chair and felt instantly irritated at herself. Of course I didn't do it. Of course I'm behind. Of course I'm failing at basic life stuff. The comment wasn't about laundry. But through the red tint, everything connected. She leaned on the counter and stared at the faucet. The metal reflected the overhead light in a thin line. She turned it on and watched the water stream out clear and steady. The sound was soothing, but her mind stayed loud. She imagined replying to the comment, not kindly, not professionally. The reply she wanted to write, the one that would make the person feel small for assuming anything. She imagined the momentary satisfaction. Then she imagined the aftermath screenshots. Argument threads, more comments, more heat. The red tint deepening until the whole world looked like an enemy. Madison shut the faucet off and pressed her palms against the cool countertop. Her hands felt cold compared to her face. She inhaled slow and exhaled like she was trying to let steam out without exploding. It wasn't just that one comment. It was the accumulation. The feeling that she had to be on all the time. That she had to prove her worth in public. That a stranger's bad mood could reach into her house and rearrange her nervous system. Madison walked back into the living room and looked at the ring light, now dark, standing there like a quiet witness. On the floor beside it were a pair of sunglasses, cheap ones tinted a warm reddish brown. She'd worn them earlier that day, driving into the sunset, mostly because they looked good on camera. She picked them up and put them on. The room changed immediately. The beige wall warmed into a dull orange. The shadows deepened. The white paper on the table looked slightly pink. Even her hands looked different, more flushed, more dramatic. Madison took them off and put them on again just to confirm it. Same room, same furniture, same messy corner. Completely different mood. She let out a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so obvious it almost felt rude. Like the world had been trying to tell her this the whole time. Anger wasn't only inside her, it was on her. It tinted everything. Through it, that comment became proof of a larger truth, that people didn't respect her, that she was always being judged, that she was alone in defending herself. But was that the whole truth? Or just the lens? Madison sat down on the couch, sunglasses in her hands. She ran her thumb along the plastic frame, feeling the little ridges near the hinge. The motion calmed her more than she expected. Small, repetitive, grounding. She thought about the person who wrote the comment. She pictured them on their own couch somewhere, thumb scrolling, annoyed at their own life, projecting it outward because it was easier than feeling it privately. That didn't make the comment okay. It didn't excuse it. But it made it smaller. A single cloud, not the entire sky. Madison rested her head back against the couch cushion and closed her eyes. Without the screen, without the light, without the performance, the anger softened into something else, hurt maybe, or tiredness, or just the simple desire to not be seen incorrectly. She didn't need to correct the whole internet tonight. She didn't need to fix her reputation in a comment section. She didn't even need to forgive. She just needed to take the glasses off. Madison left the sunglasses on the coffee table. They sat there slightly crooked, one lens catching the light from the lamp, the other in shadow. She noticed how different the room felt without them. Not brighter exactly, just clearer, less charged. The edges of things softened, when they weren't being pushed through a filter. She picked up her phone again almost automatically, then stopped. The screen lit her face for a second before she turned it back over face down. The comment was still there. She knew that. It hadn't disappeared just because she'd paused, but it also hadn't grown while she wasn't feeding it. Anger needs attention to stay loud. She went to the bedroom and changed into an oversized sweatshirt, something worn and familiar that didn't ask her to look like anything. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she looked normal, not curated, not impressive, just herself. The sight surprised her with how comforting it was. Back in the living room, Madison curled up on the couch and pulled the blanket over her legs. The lamp cast a warm circle on the wall. Outside, traffic moved in the distance, the sound low and steady. Her thoughts wandered back to the comment one more time. But it didn't hook the way it had before. It floated by like a line of text without a narrator. She could see it, but it didn't get to explain the world anymore. She thought about how often she lived like that, responding to life through whatever lens was loudest at the moment. Stress tinted her days gray. Comparison tinted them green with envy. Anger tinted them red. None of those lenses were lies, but none of them were the full picture either. Madison stood up and picked up the sunglasses again. She held them in both hands, feeling the lightness of them. Such a small object capable of changing so much. She set them back down deliberately this time, like placing something where it belonged. Not in her face, just nearby. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't mean pretending the comments didn't hurt. It meant not letting them decide the meaning of everything else. It meant taking off the lens before it stained the whole evening. She brushed her teeth, washed her face, and turned off the brighter lights. The apartment dimmed into its nighttime shape, the kind that didn't expect productivity or charm, just rest. In bed, Madison lay on her side and listened to the quiet sounds of the building. A door closing somewhere, pipes shifting, someone laughing faintly through a wall. Life continuing in ordinary ways. The anger had cooled to a low warmth now. Not gone, just manageable, no longer coloring every thought. She let her breathing slow, one gentle rhythm at a time. In, out, easy. The world didn't need her response tonight. It didn't need her defense. It didn't need her to prove anything. Without the red tint, the room was just a room. The night was just a night. And she was just a person allowed to rest without explanation. The sunglasses stayed on the table waiting for another day, and Madison, no longer looking through them, drifted into sleep with her hands unclenched, her thoughts quiet and her vision finally clear enough to let go. Tessa's hands were shaking just a little when she got home. Not the kind of shaking you can see across the room. Just the kind you notice when you try to do something simple like put your keys in the bowl by the door and miss the first time. The keys clinked against the ceramic too loud for the quiet apartment, and she winced like the sound had accused her of something. She stood there for a second, staring at the wall, letting the day sit on her shoulders. Tessa was 26, worked a front desk job at a small clinic, and most days she was good at keeping her voice calm. She smiled when people were short with her, She stayed polite when someone snapped. She made the schedule work even when it didn't. That was her skill, taking other people's mess and making it move smoothly. But today, something had gotten through. It wasn't a single big thing. It was the way a patient had spoken to her like she was furniture, the way a coworker had tossed her a last-minute task and walked away without a thank you, the way she'd swallowed it all, stacked it inside herself, and kept going. By the time her shift ended, she felt full. Not full in a satisfied way. Full like a cup filled to the rim with hot liquid. One more bump and it would spill. Now she was home and the apartment was quiet enough to hear her own thoughts. That was usually when the anger came. Not during the day, after. When the body finally had room to feel what it had been holding back. Tessa kicked off her shoes and walked straight to the kitchen sink. She didn't turn on music. She didn't check her phone. She didn't sit down. She turned the faucet on, cold. The water rushed out in a clear, steady stream. The sound filled the room immediately. Simple, constant, not asking for explanation. Tessa held her hands under it, palms up, letting the cold hit her skin. It was almost shocking. Her fingers stiffened, then slowly relaxed as the cold spread. She watched the water run over her knuckles and down into the drain, taking nothing visible with it, and still somehow making her feel lighter. Anger is heat. It rises fast, burns hot, convinces you that you need to do something with it right now, to respond, to correct, to punish, to prove you're not small. And when you can't do any of those things, the heat turns inward. It stays trapped. It cooks you from the inside out. Tessa leaned forward and let the cold water run over her wrists. The pulse points. The places that always seem to hold stress first. She didn't do it like a technique. She did it like someone reaching for something real. The anger didn't disappear, but it stopped expanding. She turned the water down just a little and listened to the softer stream. The whole moment felt strangely intimate, like the kitchen was witnessing her without judging. In her mind, she replayed the day, the words people had said, the tone, the look on a face when someone decided she didn't matter. Her chest tightened again. Then she let the cold water bring her back. Not away from the memory, just back into her own body. She grabbed a dish towel and dried her hands. The fabric was rough in a familiar way. She hung it back on the oven handle and stood there breathing, feeling the first small drop in temperature inside her. She could still feel the anger, but it wasn't in control. That was new. Tessa poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly. The coolness moved down her throat and into her chest like it was making space. A memory surfaced, something her grandmother used to say in Vietnamese when she was little. Tessa didn't remember the exact words, but she remembered the meaning. When something is too hot, you don't punch it. You cool it. You don't fight fire with more fire. You don't meet sharpness with sharpness. You bring something softer, steady, cooling something that doesn't escalate. Tessa sat at the small kitchen table and rested her arms on the surface. She didn't open her laptop. She didn't scroll. She let the room be quiet. In the quiet, she noticed something honest. A lot of her anger wasn't just about how people treated her. It was about how often she didn't protect herself. How often she smiled through things that hurt. How often she told herself it wasn't worth speaking up. Her anger wasn't evil. It was tired. It was the part of her that knew she deserved gentleness and hadn't been getting enough of it from others and from herself. That thought softened her more than it should have. Tessa blinked a few times, surprised by the sting behind her eyes. She didn't cry, not fully, just felt that thin edge where tears could happen. The body's way of cooling itself too. She stood up and turned the faucet on again, lower this time, more like a small stream than a rush. She rinsed one plate that was already clean. Not because it needed it, because the movement was steady, because the sound was steady, because it kept her from building a whole fire out of one day. The plate clinked gently in the sink. The water ran. The room stayed calm. Tessa realized she didn't have to forgive anyone tonight. She didn't have to reach for a big, noble feeling. She just had to stop burning. Cool water first, clarity later. Tessa left the kitchen light on low and moved through the apartment slowly, like she didn't want to stir the heat back up. The cold from the water still lingered in her hands, a gentle reminder that her body knew how to cool itself when she let it. She changed into soft clothes and sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, feet flat on the floor, letting the day settle. The anger returned briefly like a reflex, checking to see if it was still needed. She noticed it, then noticed how different it felt now, less sharp, more tired. Earlier, she might have let it spill. A text from a coworker, a comment online, a memory replayed too long. Any of those could have tipped her over. Tonight, she felt the moment before the spill and recognized it. That recognition alone was enough to slow things down. She went back to the sink and filled a bowl with cool water. Not icy, just cool enough to feel clear. She held the bowl in both hands, feeling the temperature through the ceramic. The weight grounded her. She set it on the counter and dipped her fingers in again briefly, then dried them on the towel. Small acts, quiet acts. They didn't fix the world. They didn't rewrite the day. They just kept her from adding more heat. Later, lying in bed, Tessa stared at the ceiling and listened to the soft nighttime sounds, the hum of the building, a distant car, the faint movement of air through the vents. Her breath slowed on its own, like her body was finally convinced it was safe to rest. The people who had been sharp with her earlier drifted through her thoughts, less defined now. Their faces blurred. Their words lost their edge. Not because they'd become kind, but because she'd stopped carrying their heat for them. Forgiveness, she understood, wasn't about saying what happened was okay. It was about choosing not to stay inflamed long after the moment had passed. Cool water doesn't argue with fire. It doesn't fight. It simply does what it does. As her thoughts softened, Tessa felt something new take its place. Not relief exactly, but spaciousness. The kind that lets the body stretch out from the inside. The kind that doesn't demand answers. Tomorrow she might speak up. Tomorrow she might set a boundary. Tomorrow she might still feel angry. But tonight she didn't need to decide any of that. Tonight she had already done the most important thing. She had cooled herself enough to rest. The bowl of water sat forgotten on the counter. The sink dried. The apartment settled into its own quiet rhythm. And Tessa, no longer burning, let the night carry the rest. It wasn't a big fight. That was part of what made it harder to place. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just a sentence said a little too quickly with a tone that landed wrong and stayed there. It happened earlier in the week, but it didn't feel finished. It followed quietly, into other conversations, into moments that should have felt normal. By the time the laundromat door slid open that night, the irritation had already found a comfortable place to sit. The room smelled faintly of detergent and warm metal. Rows of machines hummed and rattled in their own rhythms. Someone's dryer buzzed at the far end unanswered. The fluorescent lights overhead were too bright but steady, predictable. A basket of clothes was set down near an open washer. Most of it was everyday stuff. T-shirts, towels, socks missing their pairs, nothing special. And then there was the shirt. It was one of those shirts that gets worn often without much thought. Soft from use, familiar, and now noticeably stained. Not ruined, just marked enough to be annoying. The shirt was held up for a second, examined under the harsh light. The stain wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fresh. It had likely been there longer than remembered. That's how some resentments work. They don't announce themselves right away. They soak in. The thought came automatically. Why do I keep putting up with this? Not about the shirt, about the sentence. About the tone, about how easy it would be to just stop engaging. To stop showing up. To decide that enough was enough. Cutting off felt clean in theory, efficient. Like throwing something away instead of dealing with the mess of fixing it. The shirt was dropped into the washer anyway. Detergent poured in. The lid closed with a dull click. The machine began its slow, circular churn. Watching clothes spin has a strange effect. It gives the mind something repetitive to lean against, something to look at while thinking without thinking too hard. The sentence replayed again. This time louder, sharper. The mind added emphasis that hadn't been there. Facial expressions that might not have existed. A full argument built itself around a single line. Anger likes shortcuts. It prefers endings over process. It would be easier to decide the relationship was the problem. Easier to label it toxic and move on. Easier than sitting with the discomfort of admitting that something small still mattered enough to hurt. The washer sloshed. Water rushed in. The shirt disappeared into the mix, no longer separate from everything else. There was a memory uninvited. Another time. Another disagreement long ago. Another moment when walking away had seemed like strength. It had felt relieving at first. Clean, quiet. But later, there had been a strange aftertaste. Not regret exactly. More like something unfinished. A sense that something useful had been thrown out along with the frustration. The chair near the window creaked as weight settled into it. Outside, cars passed slowly, headlights smearing across the glass. No one was in a hurry here. The night had already decided its pace. The thought surfaced gently this time. What if the shirt isn't the problem? Not as an accusation, just a question. Shirts get dirty. They pick up marks from use, from being worn, from being part of a life that isn't sterile. Throwing them away every time they stain would mean never keeping anything long enough to get comfortable. That didn't mean keeping everything. Some things really do wear out. Some stains don't lift. But deciding which is which usually takes more than one look under bad lighting. The machine clanked as it shifted cycles, a low, steady sound. Not urgent, not dramatic. It became clear that the urge to cut off wasn't really about protection. It was about exhaustion, about not wanting to have the same conversation again, about wishing things were simpler than they are. Anger often disguises fatigue. The shirt was still in there, being turned over and over, not being judged, not being discarded, just being worked on. There was no guarantee it would come out clean. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the mark stays faintly visible even after effort. But washing at least gives the fabric a chance. The mind softened around that idea, not enough to forgive, not enough to forget, but enough to pause before making something final. The washer slowed. Water drained. The hum changed pitch. A small signal that one stage was ending, whether anyone was ready or not. The night outside had darkened further. The lights inside stayed the same. Sitting there, it felt possible to let the question remain unanswered for now. Not should I keep this or should I throw it away, but simply, is this worth cleaning before I decide? The machine kept turning patient in a way people rarely are. The washer went quiet before anyone noticed. Not with a dramatic stop, just a soft shift in sound that said it was done doing what it could. The lid was lifted. Warm air escaped. The smell of detergent rose clean, but not sharp. Clothes were pulled out one by one, heavy with water. Familiar shapes in new order. Towels, jeans. The shirt came last. It was held up again under the same fluorescent light. The stain was still there. Lighter now, less defined. No longer the first thing the eye landed on. That felt important. Some things don't disappear just because effort was made. They change. They soften. They stop demanding all the attention. The shirt was folded and set aside not as something precious, but as something still usable. Still part of the rotation. Still allowed. There was an unexpected easing in the chest. Not relief exactly. More like the absence of pressure that had been mistaken for resolve. Anger often tells us that distance is the same as clarity, that cutting off is the same as choosing peace. But distance without understanding can keep a problem perfectly preserved. The dryer door swung open with a dull clang. Clothes tumbled in, the door shut. The button was pressed. The machine started again, louder this time, rhythmic and steady. Heat takes longer. It asks for patience. It doesn't rush. Sitting there, it became clearer what the earlier urge had been about. Not safety, not boundaries, but the hope that walking away would end the discomfort immediately. Forgiveness doesn't usually work that way. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't clean things in one cycle. And it doesn't guarantee that nothing will stain again. What it can do is prevent every mark, from becoming a verdict. The thought of the sentence returned, but without the sharp edge it had carried before. It sounded smaller now. Still awkward, still careless, but no longer proof of something irredeemable. There was room to imagine a conversation that wasn't a confrontation, one that didn't start with accusations or finish with doors closing. Maybe it wouldn't happen tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but the option existed again. The dryer hummed. The room warmed slightly. Someone down the row laughed quietly into their phone, then lowered their voice. Life continuing in small, ordinary ways. The question shifted. Not should I forgive, but what am I actually trying to protect? Sometimes throwing something away protects us from effort more than from harm. The dryer stopped with a buzz. This time it was answered. Clothes were warm to the touch. The shirt, now dry, felt lighter in the hands than expected. The stain was still faintly there. A reminder. Not of damage, but of use. It didn't feel like a symbol of betrayal anymore. Just a sign that something had been worn long enough to matter. The basket was picked up. The night air outside was cooler. The walk to the car was quiet. No conclusions reached. No promises made. But something had changed. The anger no longer needed to be fed with final decisions. It had been acknowledged, worked through, and set aside for the night. The relationship hadn't been fixed. The sentence hadn't been erased. But the impulse to throw everything away had loosened its grip. Sometimes peace doesn't come from cutting ties. It comes from realizing that not everything needs to be decided at the height of discomfort. The shirt would be worn again, or it wouldn't. That could be decided later in better light with a clearer head. For now, it was enough to know the difference between something that needs cleaning and something that needs to be discarded, and to choose not to confuse the two. Anger doesn't always arrive as fire. Sometimes it comes as a slow burn, quiet, persistent, the kind that sits in the background and colors everything else. That night, it showed up in the shower. The bathroom was small steam already beginning to cloud the mirror. The water came on warm, then hotter. The sound filled the space steady and enclosing, like the world had narrowed down to this one narrow channel. The day had been long, not disastrous, just layered. One small frustration stacked on top of another. A tone that felt dismissive. A look that lingered a second too long. A rule applied unfairly. Nothing that would make a good story later. Just enough to accumulate. Anger thrives on accumulation. The water hit the shoulders. Muscles loosened slightly. And that's when the replay began. It wasn't one moment. It was several. Edited together. Tightened. Sharpened. The mind spoke quickly now, listing injustices, rehearsing arguments that would never be said out loud. They don't care. They always get away with it. Why does this keep happening? The body reacted before any thought finished. Jaw tight, breath shallow. Hands clenched, then unclenched, then clenched again. Hot water is supposed to relax things. But anger can turn even comfort into fuel. There was a faint sting on the skin. At first it was easy to ignore. just heat, just sensitivity, but it lingered. The shoulders began to feel raw, irritated, like the water was doing more harm than good. The temperature was adjusted down slightly. The sting eased, but didn't disappear right away. That was when the thought surfaced, uninvited but accurate. This is what it's like. Anger feels like something you pour outward. Toward a person, a system, a situation. It feels directed, purposeful, but it doesn't land where you think. Like acid rain, it eats away at the container long before it touches whatever you're aiming at. The anger that had been carried all day hadn't changed anything outside. The people involved were probably already home, already distracted by their own evenings. But inside this small bathroom, the effects were obvious. Tight muscles, shallow breathing, skin irritated by heat that should have felt soothing. The mind resisted the comparison at first. It wanted the anger to be useful, righteous, deserved. If I let this go, nothing will change, it argued. But holding it hadn't changed anything either. The water ran over the back, down the arms, pooling briefly at the elbows before disappearing down the drain. No matter how long it poured, it didn't fill anything. It didn't accumulate. It just passed through. Anger, on the other hand, stayed. There was a memory of a time when anger had been expressed openly. Years ago. A sharp confrontation. Words spoken with clarity and volume. It had felt powerful in the moment. Later, there had been a hollow feeling. The relationship hadn't improved. The situation hadn't resolved. The anger had simply found a new place to sit. The water temperature was turned down again, cooler now. The skin began to calm, the sting faded. The mind slowed just enough to notice something underneath the anger. Fatigue, disappointment, the quiet sadness of feeling unseen. Anger often steps in front of those feelings. It speaks louder, so they don't have to. The shower filled with steam again. The mirror disappeared completely this time. No reflection, no face, just heat and sound. It became clear that the anger wasn't protecting anything anymore. It was corroding. The body leaned slightly into the tile, forehead cool against the wall. A long breath went out heavier than expected. There was no decision to forgive, no vow to be calm. Just the recognition that continuing like this would keep burning the same place over and over. The anger was still there, but it had lost some of its urgency, some of its authority. The water continued to fall, indifferent, neutral. It didn't care about blame or fairness. It just moved where gravity took it. And standing there, it was possible to see that anger, too, could be allowed to move, to pass, not to be poured endlessly into the same container. The sting was gone now. The skin felt normal again. The shower kept running. The shower was turned off, but the heat lingered. Steam hung in the air, slow to leave. Drops of water slid down the tile-thin lines, tracing paths that didn't last very long. A towel was reached for. The fabric felt rough at first, then comforting. The skin underneath was warm, slightly pink, but no longer irritated. It had already begun to settle. That felt important. Anger rarely ends when the moment ends. It looks for somewhere else to go. A new target. A memory. A person who isn't even in the room. Standing there wrapped in a towel, the mind tried again. It brought up the same faces, the same conversations. This time with sharper edges. It wanted direction. It wanted an outlet. The urge was familiar, to send a message, to complain to someone else, to replay the story with better wording, clearer, blame, stronger justification. But something had shifted. The body felt calmer than the thoughts. That mismatch was noticeable. The chest wasn't tight anymore. The shoulders weren't raised. The anger no longer had full access to the nervous system. It was still loud, but it wasn't driving. That's when the metaphor returned clearer now. Acid rain doesn't destroy in one pour. It works slowly, quietly, over time. It weakens structures from the inside long before anything collapses. The anger that had been carried all day hadn't ruined anyone else's evening. It hadn't corrected behavior. It hadn't brought fairness. It had just kept the body tense, the mind restless, the skin raw. A mirror cleared enough to show a blurred reflection. Not sharp, not detailed, just a shape. A person standing there tired. The towel was adjusted, hair was pushed back. A breath came in, then out. Normal, unforced. There was a memory of someone once saying, "If you don't let it out, it'll eat you alive." At the time, that had sounded true, responsible even. But maybe letting it out didn't always mean throwing it at someone else. Maybe it meant letting it move through without giving it a permanent home. The anger didn't need to be suppressed. It didn't need to be justified. It just didn't need to be stored. Getting dressed felt slower than usual. Intentional without trying to be. The simple actions, pulling on a shirt, tying the drawstring, brought attention back to the present moment. In the other room, the house was quiet. No notifications, no voices. Just the low hum of the heater clicking on and off. The mind tried once more to revive the anger, but it came back thinner this time, less convincing. Like a story that had already been told too many times. It was easier now to see what had been happening. The anger had felt like armor, like proof of self-respect, like energy. But armor gets heavy when worn too long. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a decision not to keep corroding from the inside. A choice not to pour more acid into a container that was already showing wear. That didn't mean trusting again. It didn't mean approving what had happened. It just meant choosing a different relationship with the anger itself. The phone stayed where it was. No messages sent, no explanations drafted. Tomorrow could handle tomorrow's responses. Tonight was about stopping the damage. The body moved toward the bedroom. Lights were turned off one by one. Each click felt like a small boundary being set, not against people but against the habit of carrying what wasn't helping. Lying down, the muscles released more fully. The mind still wandered, but without the same heat, without the same urgency. Anger hadn't disappeared. It probably wouldn't. but it no longer felt like something that needed to be poured, defended, or fed. It felt like weather, and weather passes. The room cooled slowly. The last of the steam faded from the bathroom. The skin finished calming itself, doing what it knows how to do when given the chance. Nothing had been solved, but something important had stopped, and that was enough for tonight. She notices the draft before she notices the noise. It slips in through the small gap beneath the back door, barely strong enough to move the curtain, but enough to brush against her ankles as she stands in the kitchen. The room is dim, lit only by the soft yellow bulb above the sink and the faint glow of the streetlight outside the window. She sets her bag down on the counter and exhales long and slow, the way people do when they're trying to leave the day behind without fully knowing how. Her shoulders feel tight, like they've been holding something upright for hours. Outside, a car passes. Somewhere down the block, someone laughs too loudly, the sound sharp in the quiet. Her phone buzzes once, then again, resting face up on the counter as if it has something important to say. She doesn't look at it yet. Instead, she opens a drawer and takes out a small candle. It's nothing special, just one she picked up months ago and never used. She sets it near the sink, pushes aside a dish towel, and strikes a match. The flame catches with a quick, dry sound, then steadies thin and upright. For a moment, it holds perfectly still. Then the draft reaches it. The flame bends slightly, leaning to one side, its shape changing with every faint movement of air. It doesn't go out, but it doesn't stand straight either. It wavers, adjusting again and again. She watches it longer than she expects to. Her phone buzzes once more. This time she glances at the screen. A message preview, a headline. Someone's opinion delivered quickly and without invitation. Her chest tightens in response, the familiar pull to read, to respond, to explain. She turns the phone face down. The flame flickers again, reacting instantly to the shift in air as she moves. It doesn't resist. It doesn't complain. It simply responds moment by moment, doing what flames do to stay alive. She leans against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the candle. The day has been full of voices, meetings, conversations layered with expectations, advice given freely, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. Even now, alone in her kitchen, the noise hasn't stopped. It hums quietly inside her, replaying comments, imagining responses, anticipating what someone might think next. She tells herself she should be used to this by now. Careers, relationships, daily life, all of it comes with opinions. You learn to handle it. You learn to listen selectively. At least that's what she's always believed. But watching the candle, she notices something she hasn't thought about before. The flame isn't trying to block the wind. It isn't fighting it. And yet it isn't letting the wind define it either. When the draft grows stronger, the flame bends lower, shrinking its shape, conserving itself. When the air stills, it rises again, bright and steady. She feels something soften in her chest. Her phone buzzes again, more insistently this time. A new message. Another voice asking for attention. She picks it up, reads just enough to know it will pull her into a familiar spiral if she lets it. She doesn't respond. Instead, she reaches for the door and presses it closed more firmly, feeling the latch catch with a soft click. The draft weakens immediately. The flame straightens its light, growing calmer, more contained. She hadn't realized how much air had been moving through the room. She sits down at the small kitchen table, the candle between her and the sink, and rests her hands in her lap. The silence isn't complete. The refrigerator hums. The building settles. The city breathes beyond the walls. But something important has shifted. For a long time, she's believed that peace comes from managing everything outside her. From responding quickly. From correcting misunderstandings before they grow. From staying alert to every change in tone. Now sitting here, she sees how exhausting that has been. The flame doesn't ask the wind to stop. It simply adjusts its own shape and relies on the space immediately around it. When the space is calmer, the flame thrives without effort. She thinks about how often she's left her own doors open, letting every opinion rush in, believing it's her responsibility to stay exposed. The candle burns quietly, its wax beginning to pool at the base. Nothing dramatic happens. No realization crashes through her. Just a gentle awareness settling into place. She doesn't need to put herself out to survive the noise. She watches the flame a little longer, letting its steady presence anchor her attention, and for the first time all evening, her mind stops racing ahead to the next thing that might disturb her. She doesn't blow the candle out. That thought crosses her mind for a moment, the way it often does when something feels slightly overwhelming. Ending it would be simple. One breath, and the light would disappear. Instead, she reaches for a small glass bowl from the counter and turns it upside down, placing it near the flame without covering it. The glass catches the light, reflecting it back softly, changing the way the shadows move along the wall. The candle burns on calmer now, less reactive to the faint movements of air in the room. She leans back in her chair and lets her hands rest on the table. The position feels unfamiliar, like she's no longer bracing herself for something. Her shoulders lower, and the space between her thoughts begins to widen, not because she's trying to quiet her mind, but because there's less to react to. Her phone vibrates again. She doesn't flinch this time. She reaches for it slowly, as if testing how much attention it actually deserves. The screen lights up. Another message, another opinion, another small demand for response. She reads it once, then sets the phone down a little farther away, out of easy reach. Nothing in the room changes. The candle doesn't flicker in protest. The walls don't close in. The night continues indifferent to her decision. She realizes how often she's treated every notification like a gust of wind she has to face head on. Every message, every comment, every reaction has felt like something she must answer immediately, as if her calm depended on staying engaged. But watching the candle now, she sees that calm isn't something you defend by standing exposed. It's something you protect by choosing how much air you let in. She gets up and turns off the kitchen light, leaving only the candle's glow. The room softens instantly, edges blurring just enough to feel gentle. The shadows deepen, but they don't feel threatening. They feel like rest. She sits back down and lets her eyes follow the small movements of the flame. Even sheltered, it still shifts slightly, responding to the subtle currents of the room. It isn't frozen. It isn't rigid. It's alive, adjusting without panic. That feels important. For a long time, she's believed that being strong meant staying open to everything, taking it all in, enduring the noise, proving she could handle it. But that strength has often come at the cost of her own steadiness. Now she sees another kind of strength taking shape. It's quieter, less impressive. It doesn't argue or explain. It simply chooses where to stand. She thinks about the conversations she's replayed in her head, the ones she wishes had gone differently. The comments that linger longer than they should. The imagined judgments that follow her home even when no one is actually speaking. They still exist. She knows that. The world hasn't softened just because she has. But they feel farther away now, like sounds from another room with the door gently closed. She exhales slow and full, and feels the tension drain from her neck. The candle's light reflects in the glass bowl, doubling and then softening, as if the flame has found a way to rest without disappearing. She doesn't promise herself she'll always protect her peace this way. She doesn't turn it into a rule or a resolution. She knows there will be days when the doors are left open again, when the wind rushes in and the flame wavers. Tonight doesn't need to solve every other night. It only needs to be this one. She sits there until the wax has melted further, until the flame has settled into a steady, patient burn. The phone remains silent on the counter, not because the world has stopped talking, but because she has stopped inviting it so close. When she finally stands to blow the candle out, she does it gently with intention. The smoke rises in a thin, quiet line, then fades into the air. The room darkens, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels protected. They notice the shadow before they notice themselves. It stretches long across the sidewalk, darker than expected, shaped by the streetlight behind them. For a moment, it looks almost like someone else walking ahead, moving when they move, stopping when they stop. They slow their pace. The night is quiet in that way neighborhoods get after most windows have gone dark. A porch light hums softly. Somewhere a dog shifts in its sleep. Their own footsteps sound louder than usual, each one landing with a clear, deliberate rhythm. They glance down again. The shadow has changed shape longer now, thinner, reaching farther than it should. It makes their chest tighten in a small, familiar way. They don't like this time of night. Not because it's dangerous, but because it leaves too much room for thought. During the day, there are distractions, conversations, things that demand attention. At night, the mind wanders freely, and it doesn't always choose gentle places to go. They tell themselves to walk faster, but instead they slow, even more curious, despite the discomfort. The shadow isn't threatening. It isn't doing anything. It's just there, following faithfully, no matter how they try to ignore it. They think about how often they've felt this way, about parts of themselves. Traits they'd rather not acknowledge. Reactions that surprise them. Thoughts that appear suddenly uninvited and linger longer than they'd like. During the day, they manage these parts carefully. They stay polite, controlled, reasonable. But at night, those edges feel sharper, harder to look away from. A breeze moves through the trees lining the street, and the leaves respond with a soft rustle. The shadow shivers with the movement of branches above, breaking into uneven shapes along the pavement. They stop under the light. The shadow pools around their feet now, shorter, darker, less dramatic. It doesn't stretch ahead anymore. It waits. They stand there, hands in their pockets, feeling the cool air on their face. The light behind them casts a clear outline, honest and unflattering. There's no place for the shadow to hide. They wonder when they started believing that shadows mean something is wrong. Shadows appear because there is light. Without light, there would be nothing to cast them. This is something they know in theory, something simple enough to explain, yet difficult to remember. When the mind starts to judge itself harshly, they shift their weight from one foot to the other. The shadow follows, obedient and immediate. They remember times they've replayed their own mistakes late at night, watching them grow larger in their thoughts, stretching farther than they ever did in reality. One comment, one reaction, one imperfect moment becomes a shape that seems to define them entirely. Standing here, they notice how the shadow distorts when they move, how it lengthens and shrinks depending on their position, not because it has changed, but because the light has. The realization settles slowly. Maybe the parts of themselves they fear aren't growing. Maybe the angle has just changed. They take a step forward out of the brightest part of the light. The shadow stretches again, reaching ahead, exaggerated and unfamiliar. The feeling returns, a slight unease, a tightening in the stomach. They pause, then step back. The shadow shortens. Nothing about them has changed, only their position. They let out a quiet breath, the kind that releases a thought before it has time to turn into a story. The street remains empty. The night remains still. For a long time, they've tried to outrun this feeling, to walk faster than their doubts, to stay busy enough that the shadow never has time to catch up. But it always does. Now, standing here under the streetlight, they try something different. They turn around slowly. The shadow slips behind them, no longer in front, no longer something to watch. They can't see it now, but they know it's still there, doing exactly what it has always done. Following. They stand like that for a moment, facing the light, feeling its warmth faintly on their back. The darkness behind them doesn't feel as heavy when they aren't staring directly into it. They begin to walk again, this time without checking the pavement every few steps. The shadow stays with them, unseen, but present. And for the first time tonight, that doesn't feel like a threat. They walk for a while without thinking about the shadow at all. Their attention drifts to the sound of their breathing, the steady pattern of steps, the quiet consistency of the street. The houses pass by one after another, each one dark or softly lit, holding lives that have already settled into sleep. When a thought tries to pull them back inward, they notice it and keep walking. The streetlight behind them fades, replaced by another farther ahead. With each shift of light, the shadow changes again, stretching, shrinking, breaking apart, coming back together. It's never the same shape twice, and yet it's always connected to them. They think about how often they've tried to define themselves by their worst moments. How easily the mind collects imperfections and lines them up as evidence as if they tell the whole story. Tonight those thoughts arrive more gently. They pass a parked car, its surface catching the glow of the light for a brief second before releasing it. The reflection moves across the metal and disappears, leaving nothing behind. It reminds them of how fleeting attention can be when it isn't held in place by fear. They slow near an intersection, waiting for the crosswalk light to change. The road is empty, but habit keeps them still. The red hand glows steadily, patient and unbothered. While they wait, a familiar thought surfaces, a memory they usually avoid. It's imperfect, uncomfortable, tied to a version of themselves they wish had known better. This time they don't turn away. They let the memory be there without explanation or defense. They notice how it feels in the body, where it tightens, where it loosens. They don't add commentary. They don't label it as good or bad. The crosswalk light changes. They step forward, and the memory doesn't follow. It stays behind, fading naturally, like the shadow when the light shifts again. They realize something then, quietly and without ceremony. The shadow has never been chasing them. It has never been trying to overtake them or pull them down. It has only been responding to the light they stand in and the direction they choose to face. When they turn toward the light, the shadow moves out of sight. When they turn away, it stretches ahead and demands attention. Neither position is wrong, but one feels easier to live with. They reach the end of the block and turn the corner, leaving the street lights behind for a stretch of darker road. The shadow becomes faint, barely visible, blending into the night. They don't feel relieved. They feel steady. For years they've tried to get rid of the parts of themselves they don't like, to fix them, to think them away, to pretend they don't exist. All that effort has only made those parts louder in the quiet moments. Now, walking through the softer darkness, they sense a different approach taking shape. They don't need to love every part of themselves tonight. They don't need to understand it all. They don't need to resolve every inner conflict. They only need to stop running. A breeze passes through, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and leaves. It settles on their skin and then moves on, leaving nothing behind. The night feels wider now, less crowded by judgment. As they near their building, the entrance light comes on, automatically illuminating the path ahead. Their shadow appears once more, brief and unremarkable, then disappears as they step inside. The door closes softly behind them. In the quiet stairwell, they pause, hand resting on the railing. The light overhead hums faintly, steady and contained. There is no shadow here, only clean walls and even illumination. They notice how little they miss it. Not because it was something to fear, but because it no longer needs their attention. They climb the stairs slowly, unhurried, feeling the solid presence of each step beneath their feet. Their thoughts move at the same pace, no longer racing ahead or circling back. By the time they reach their door, the night feels settled inside them. They turn the key, step into the dim room, and close the door gently behind them. The light is enough. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, You're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.